Um, so what we're going to do is just go through this passage. And I think how we'll work this out, because I want you to start working on pronunciation some, but I'm going to ask a question before we begin that might obviate that a little bit. But what I was planning on doing is, I would read a line, ask somebody to translate, read a line, ask somebody to translate, and then maybe read a line and then ask somebody to read that line in Old English after me. But before I do that, trying to think how to put this question delicately / politically. How many of you are taking this course solely for the foreign language requirement? Is anybody taking it solely for the foreign language requirement? I see one yes. Nobody else is giving me any indication. Yeah. Okay. So the rest of you, therefore, are really interested in Old English, learning the language, wanting to do whatever in it later in life. Or is it primarily to get through the language requirement? Language requirement, Sarah? You're muted. There you go.
Oh, sorry.
Language requirement?
Yes.
Okay.
Since I'm in Old English stuff anyway.
Okay. In that case, see, my internet is, hold on, let me switch to a different network. And see if that one works better. My internet literally 15, 20 minutes ago started going strange. So I'm going to be really short today. Okay, in that case, we're not going to worry as much about pronunciation. We'll still work on it some, but you probably, since it sounds like most of you probably will not be going to a conference and doing a paper on a topic of Old English and reading aloud in Old English, we won't emphasize that as much as I normally would, right? So, Alfred the Great's preface to the Pastoral Care. Several of you, I don't think all of you did, but at least 2 of you read articles this week about the preface or about Alfred's translation program. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get into this, because it's pretty significant and pretty important. But all of you, I think all of you submitted your summaries. All of you, your articles were really good. I think I posted something about this earlier today. The articles were all good and solid. And a couple of you have now used articles or referred to articles by Malcolm Godden. Pretty much anything by him is top notch. He was probably one of the top, I don't know, 5 or 10 Anglo-Saxonists in the world. I mean, anything he writes is pretty solid. Roy Liuzza, who's at UT, pretty much the same. John Hill, I don't think anybody's done one by Hill yet. Trying to remember some of the other names that I saw. But those are all pretty good, solid ones. So, before we begin, let me put up something. In the late 17th century, and I thought your introduction mentioned this, and I reread it a couple of times today, and I don't see it anywhere. In the late 16th century, no, take that back, late 17th century, 1695, 93, something like that. A farmer in Somerset was plowing his fields, and he discovered something. So let me see if I can find it. Hold on. And what he found was, back to Zoom, back to share. Oops. What he found was this. It's called the Alfred jewel. Okay. The whole thing, if I remember right, is, I don't think this gives a description in terms of the size. Hold on just a second. Leave that off. I'm looking at another source. Yeah, there it is. It's, the whole thing is about 2.5 inches from the bottom to the top, right? And what you have in here is what's called cloisonné. I think it's spelled Cloissone, French word, glasswork. And what you see right there, you see he's got in his hand, he's holding something that looks like it's got a flower or stem on the end. That's gold. It's like gold wire separating the little pieces of glass. The blue, I'm pretty sure, is lapis lazuli. The red is garnet. And then all of this is just solid gold, right? There's another picture. Hold on, I think I've got a switch going. Stop sharing. There's another picture of it where I'm still not fast enough on sharing pages on Zoom. This is from Wikipedia. So this is, kind of what it looks like. And this is what the image on the inside looks like if you were to take it out of its frame. So it literally looks like he's holding a couple of stalks with flowers or something, right? And then this is what the back of it looks like. I don't know how well you can see that. Right? All engraved. And the interesting thing about that is it's thought that one of these was probably sent with each copy of this text of the Pastoral Care. Okay. The other interesting thing about that particular item, the Alfred jewel, it's thought that at the end where there was like a little cup, that probably held a short, like a piece of dowel or rod, maybe 4 inches, and that it was used as a pointer. So you would hold on to the jewel, the gold part, you would hold on to that and point with the end of it at words as you read across a page. Keep in mind, reading in Alfred's period was different than our time and was different than in ancient, for example, Greco-Roman time. Silent reading was pretty much unheard of. So when people would read, they'd read aloud. Silent reading didn't really enter, I don't know what you call it, become a dominant practice until the later Middle Ages. Right? So you point at each word and go on along. Where this was found is in the area where, when I talked about last week, Alfred hid in the marshes during the winter of 878, and then he came out in January and defeated Guthrum the Dane later on that spring. Well, that's like where it was found was like literally in that exact same area. So there's some speculation that it was lost, dropped, while Alfred was essentially hiding in the marshes, which, you know, if that's the case, then that would indicate this was his personal, okay? Let me go back to another image for a minute to show you this. Share screen. This is what is inscribed on the outside of the medal. Alfred, notice it's got a cross, you know, kind of a blessing thing. Alfred, Mech, M-E-C, H-E-H, and notice the second bar of the H is forming the T. This is a G, yeah, G-E-W. This is an oddly shaped Y, R-C. Alfred, Mech, Hate, you work, and there's an A-N off the side that you can, that I can barely see, at least without the screen's working out. Alfred ordered me to be made, is what that says. And it's thought, go back to this for just a second. And go back. It's thought that this is a representation of King Alfred, which if it is, it's the only one we have. I think there are some images in manuscript, but it's the only, you know, kind of a pictorial, so to speak, which is kind of cool when you think about it. Okay. So Alfred has these books translated. What books does he have translated? Well, obviously Gregory's Pastoral Care, and we're gonna get into that briefly. And he tells us why, very clearly, in the preface, why he wants it translated. Whether or not Alfred personally is responsible for the translation, probably not the case. It's probably Werferth, the bishop, who might have done the translation actually. Okay, so he had translated 4 major works, all right? Gregory's Pastoral Care, and again, he tells us why. Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, he has that translated into English, right? Old English. It had been translated into, let me rephrase that. It was available in Latin. All these things were available in Latin. And we're going to talk about why he translates them when we get into the preface itself. Bede's Ecclesiastical History. Bede was familiar with the Consolation of Philosophy. Bede was familiar with Gregory's Pastoral Care. Bede wrote Bede wrote commentaries and homilies actually on books of the Bible, and he used works by Gregory the Great, etc. Okay, and then Orosius's, who was a Spanish historian, 4th century. Orosius wrote a big, long, massive book called, it's kind of, its short title is just The History of the World. Okay? It's not literally, though, a history of the world. Its real title, if you're to translate it into English, is 7 Books of History Against the Pagans. So it's the Historiae Adversus Paganos. Sorry, Historiae Adversus Paganos Libri Septem. So the history against the pagans in 7 books, right? So notice what you have there. You have a history of the world, Christians against the pagans. That's 1 book, okay? Bede's, so that's kind of, you know, all-encompassing. Then you have Bede's, history of the English-speaking people. So that's much more narrowly focused, okay? Consolation of Philosophy, which, have any of you read that before? Okay, one Sarah has. It's pretty much the Boethius's attempt to answer the question, why bad things happen to good people. More specifically, why bad things are happening to me, Boethius, okay? He's writing it, what's the phrase? You go to prison, he's on death row, okay, capital offense, right? And then there's another work that he has translated that sometimes you'll find it in history, you'll find it included in listings of works that Alfred has translated, and sometimes it's not. So I'm going to include it. And these are the soliloquies of St. Augustine, okay? And then Gregory's Pastoral Care. So they're largely all works of a quote unquote spiritual nature. And, you know, Alfred makes pretty clear in his preface why he's having those works translated, or why he is translating those works, okay? So let's get into it. So Alfred, the title, Theospoke shall to we are, I can never say that word, we are Gorachastra. This book shall, I mean, literally, it's just, this book shall to Worcester. If you pronounce it in modern English, Worcester. You don't say Worcester, okay? The middle CES is elided out. And so Marsden gives you his gloss. This book is meant to go, that is, whoever he hands it to, take this book to Worcester, where Fairth is the bishop, okay? Then Alfred writes, and I'm going to read it, and then I'm just going to ask, one of you to volunteer. Alfred King hateth greatan werferth, bishop his wordum lovliche on. Anybody want to translate that? And okay, Chelsea, before you do, I'm going to ask you to do something. Translate it first, literally, word for word. And then if you can, massage it a little bit, make it more real English, okay? And I know part of it's not gonna make sense because we broke it up in the middle of the sentence, but just that line. Okay, go ahead.
Alfred King.
Mm-hmm.
But what I wrote down is the more massage one.
Okay, that's fine.
Means to be greeted.
Mm-hmm.
Warford, bishop, his words.
Okay. When you have that dative plural, the wardum, whenever you see a dative, and this is something I learned when I took Latin as a doctoral student. I mean, it was after I'd had Old English, so I'd had a little bit of it in Old English. When you have the dative case in modern English, we don't have dative cases anymore because we don't have inflectional endings. I mean, we have direct object and indirect object, yes. So what do we do if we're using a word as an indirect object? What do we often see before that word? Yeah, so with his words, yeah. So to, for, with, by, through, something like that. So whenever you see that dative, what I would suggest doing is just writing in to/with/for immediately. And then when you go back and try to kind of make sense of it, you look at the context. And okay, so which one of those works better? Okay. So now put that in more modern English syntax. Okay. Freundliche anfekudan hatte thought me kom swede oft on yemin. Anybody?
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you want to?
You can go ahead. I don't care.
Okay. Let's see. So, added affectionately and command that it be known to you that to me has come very often in mind.
Okay, stop there. So that's all perfect. Notice with both luvliche and friendliche, the ending of the word, the liche. What does that become in modern English? Just ly. Yeah, and that's because, notice, liche is 2 syllables, modern English, li, and that's because the liche, the che, essentially, a couple hundred years after this, that final syllable is going to stop really having any kind of emphasis at all, and it will just drop off entirely, okay? So, friendly, and the the kuden hata, they is to you. The they there, that's like Elizabethan English. Take that back. It's not really Elizabethan English. It's King James English. Ye. Okay? O ye of little faith. O you of little faith. Okay. So that's that. That's what that is there. So when you see, somebody opens a bookstore or something, and they call it ye old bookstore. That ye, that's grammatically wrong. Because what they mean there is they mean thorn, okay, the letter thorn with an E, which is what becomes the, not the other one, okay? So the hate, if you remember from the parsing, that's first person singular. That's, Alfred saying, and I command. So earlier, King Alfred commands, third person, he commands, but then it's, and I command, I order, Qdhan. That's, to be made known, or for you to know that may calm. What does that mean when you really think about it? It's come where? Often to me in my mind. So it's coming from out there in here. So these memories, these ideas, they're coming from outside. That's going to be an interesting construction that we're going to see throughout Old English. We're going to hear, for example, in the Dream of the Rood, that a dream came to the dreamer. He said, it dreamed to me. Like it's out there floating in the air, and it sticks to him, right? Walche, we taught you wherein yond angelkin, either yagod kundra hadaye. Anybody? All right, Elizabeth?
What wise men formerly learned throughout both in sacred orders.
You can stop there because it goes on to the next one. Could you have the either yet something which means either or whether or both and it gets concluded. Okay, that's good. World kundra, so sacred orders, spiritual orders, religious orders, and world kundra, worldly orders. Unto yesale licha, right, or lika. Notice it's not dotted, but it's between the front vowel, the E, and the back vowel, ah. If it's between 2 front vowels, it's dotted. It's the ch sound. If it's between 2 back vowels, it's not. If it comes at the end of a syllable or word, it's pronounced ch. If it comes at the beginning of a syllable and is followed by one of those back vowels, A, O, U, then it's ka. That's why it's, lost my place. Yesali lika. Kida, Thaweran yond angelkin, on who? Anybody? Okay, sure.
Secular ones, and how happy to times more than throughout the English nation, and how.
Okay, very good. Verkynningas de van aanwaldhavden vas volkes Gode and his errand rekum. Notice again, volkes, okay? Volk and then s, right? And it's errand rekum. So somebody translate that. Verkynningas de van aanwald. Who hasn't gone yet? Okay, Sarah.
How the king ruled over the people.
Keep going. Yep. Okay. Go back and do it word for word.
Sorry, I lost my page.
That's okay.
I think I have the kings ruled over the people.
Well, what about the Thethona?
I think I skipped that one.
Anybody else?
Is that right? Minister? Yeah.
Well, I didn't hear that question.
Is it the Sarah?
No. The Verkynningas, so it's plural, those the kings or those kings, Thethona onward, who, the the is, no, who, that, onwald, rule, have done, had, fast focus, of the people, God and his, how did you translate Aaron Reckon? I know there's a gloss. Ministers, okay? Okay. Here Sumadon, and he either Yehiora Siba, Yehiora Siodo, Yehiora Onweld. Lainey, you looked up.
Yeah, which I know is struggling with this, but have obeyed, and they either view their king, view their authority.
Keep going. Because there's three Yehiora phrases.
Sorry, I wrote it separately down.
Okay.
I have to look. Morality?
For
Sorry, view their morality, view their authority.
okay, let's look at the gloss down at the bottom. That's what, line 7? They obeyed. Siba is peace. Okay. Siodo is morality. So who either their peace or their morality or their what's onweld?
I think I might have accidentally left that off.
Anybody?
Control.
Control, rule. You could probably even extrapolate authority,
Yeah, authority.
possibly.
I might have wrote down authority.
Okay.
Because that's what I got for.
Okay. Lost my place. In and Bordis, well, Yehodan, and Ek ut hira edel Urimdon, and who him. Who hasn't gone yet? Bethany hasn't gone yet. Do you have it? If you don't, that's fine. Okay. Anybody? In and Bordis.
At home, well maintained, and also beyond their territory extended, and how it.
Okay. The word you translate, and it's glossed at, territory, evil. What is it really? It's the homeland, their fatherland. How many of you have ever seen the musical, The Sound of Music? It's got a very famous scene where Christopher Plummer sings the Austrian national, I think it's the national anthem, or it's like the national folk song, Edelweiss. That word Edel in Edelweiss, that's the same word as is right there. Right? It's you know, in that instance, it's the national flower. It's the flower of the homeland, the fatherland, etc. Okay. Okay, I'm going to read several lines now, and then we'll just kind of go through so that it doesn't. So we speed it up a little bit. Where was it? On who him? So spell either Yemedwiya, Yemedwizdoma, an eak God kunden hades, who Yarna hier waren, either Yim Lara, Yim Leornunga, Yim Ealatha, Theo Wat Domas, The hier Gododon Shorda. On who man utanbordes, wisdom, on the Lara hier on land, Sochta, on who way here, nu Sheldon, Utabietan, Yifway, hier haben Sheldon. Okay, so I finished at the end of, or not the end, somewhere on line 13. So if someone would pick up on line 9, Thaspiel either.
I can go.
Okay,
Prospered both with warfare and with wisdom,
good,
and also in sacred orders.
Good.
How zealous they were in teaching and in learning,
good.
and in all the services that they ought to perform for God, and how men from abroad came seeking wisdom and learning here in this land, and how we now would have to obtain it from abroad if we have it.
Okay, very good. So what he's talking about there, well, let me ask you, what do you think he's talking about there? How men from abroad came to England before to seek out learning. And he says, and now, if we want that kind of learning, we have to go elsewhere to seek out that kind of learning. Okay, Alfred's translating this sometime probably after 878, probably 880, maybe 885 or so, something like that. So when was there a time in Britain, let's say, where you had men of such learning, and women I would include, because Abbot's Hill figures in here, men and women of such learning that people would come from, for example, the continent to learn, or would come from the continent to find teachers to take back to the continent. Called the Golden Age of Northumbria. It begins in the late 7th century. Definitely probably by 675, right? Cadman is alive and composing poems, if Cadman is a real figure, in the late 670s. He dies around, I think in fact it's the same year as Abbot's Hill, which is 681. Okay, Bede is alive and writing then. Okay, and Bede, lives in Northumbria at the what are called the twin monasteries of Yarrow and Wearmouth. That's also near where Cadman and Abbot's Hill are. Lindisfarne is a famous monastery and seat of monastic learning up off the northeast coast of England. And this is in the proverbial dark ages of Europe. Okay? What today we would call northern England had such an advanced state of learning. And usually if I'm in class at this time, I'll bring in a stack of books and start passing things around. This, for example, this is the period when the Lindisfarne Gospels hold on. When the Lindisfarne Gospels are being produced, and we'll just do this. So here's an example of one of the pages in the Lindisfarne Gospels. This is called a carpet page because it kind of looks like a Persian carpet, right? Well, if you were to, yeah, there we go, zoom in there, there's actually only one line throughout this entire page. That is when the artist draws this, he starts at one spot and the whole thing just goes all the way throughout. There's probably not a calligrapher alive today who could literally reproduce this page, okay? Give you another. Can you see that one? Or do I have to share that page too? You can't see it? Okay. Another one. Notice this is a cruciform. So you've got a cross and then you've got all the, and look within each of those curls. It's all this zoomorphic design because there's a bird or something, because that looks like a beak in almost every one of these. And then there's, at various other places, you'll see little frog-like creatures, lizard-like creatures, et cetera, right? So that's the period that Alfred is talking about. In fact, the north of England was so well known that in the late 8th century, when Charlemagne was looking for someone to teach his children and the children of his courtiers, men and women at court in the town of Aachen in Germany, he went to England. He didn't live personally, he sent a messenger to England and he brought over a man who is today known first name of the place he was from. Sarah's nodding her head. Who is it? You know who it is, Sarah?
I think it's
Alcuin of York, okay? Who we'll talk about at a later point, because Alcuin, he goes off to Aachen, he teaches Charlemagne's kids and stuff. And a little bit later, in about 793 or so, it's almost contemporaneous with Viking raids. Alcuin sends a letter back to England to one of the monasteries because word has reached him that, while the monks are sitting there eating dinner at the refectory table, when another monk, usually the most junior, a novice or something like that, should be standing up and reading either a life of a saint or homily or a passage of scripture while everybody eats, because there's no talking, there's no fun while eating. Word has reached Alcuin that at this particular monastery, whoever is standing up and reading isn't reading, he is singing ancient pagan songs. He's singing, he literally talks about ENGL, who is a character in Beowulf, okay? We'll talk about that later. So that's the period, that's the time frame Alfred is talking about. Somewhere between 100 to possibly 200 years before Alfred's own day, right? Now, think about this for a minute. What is Alfred essentially saying about 200 years ago? We hear the same kind of language used today. Oh, say it again.
for the good old days.
Meaning what though? Why is it the good old days?
Because the state of education and learning declined so much in England.
It's the golden age. Yeah. I mean, you have Ovid, who writes about the 4 ages of man, first century Rome. You've got you've got Hesiod writing about the golden age in 6th or 7th BC Greece, okay? You've got people in Shakespeare's day talking about Chaucer's day being the golden age of English. You've got John Dryden talking about Shakespeare's period being the golden age. You've got people today talking about the founders of the United States being, if only we had, statesmen and women, like them, et cetera, et cetera. It's this looking back to when times were simpler, not necessarily. Better, not necessarily. Different. Different. I mean, Alfred's writing this. Viking invasions are going on still in other parts of England. He had no idea of 2020, but people in 2020 look back, even last year ago, man, 2018, 2019, whatever. Okay, so that's partly what he's doing. Okay, so notice in and bordis. The bordis is related to the phrase room and board. When you get room and board, what do you get? You get a room, and what else? Food. Well, where's food served? Usually. Dining room or something like that. Well, in the Anglo-Saxon period, you had single room halls, like the King's Hall would be a big, massive timbered hall, etc. But the inn and bordis means the innermost, part of the home. So he's talking about the innermost part of England at this time, okay? So he says, we've got to go outside. Now, where might he be talking about? Not Paris. Paris is a dumpy little place at this point, okay? He could be talking about northern Germany, Aachen, where, Alcuin had gone to, etc. Okay, so let me pick up line, whatever that was, 13. Swarklana hio was oathfallen an andelkinna that swi the feoa wherein behionan humbra the hioratheninga kuden understanden on English o the furthum on erinjerit of ladena on English Orechian on ich wena that Thata noch moniga lost my place. I need one of those pointers right now. Beyond den Humbra Nera. So somebody want to pick up with Swaklana. Okay.
So completely she was fallen away in England that very few were on the side of the river Humber. Then their services could understand in English, or moreover a letter of Latin in English translate. And I imagine that not many in Northumbria were not.
Right.
I think I got that one.
Or there were not. There's a lot of times where we would throw in a there or a the, okay? So, but notice the word that gets translated completely. Clana. Well, it's modern English, clean. So how do you get completely from clean? Well, think if something's clean, it's what? Is there a little bit of dirt? No, it's entirely clean. So clean means completely, totally devoid of whatever the thing is that it's cleaned of. So he's kind of saying, so clean, the hio, it's literally she, but it's not she, it's just it or the, was old fallen u. what was the oath fallen again? Line 13. Fallen away. Fallen, 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 fallen. Okay. So what is it that was so cleanly fallen away? Learning. It was destroyed, he says in Anglican, that in Anglican, the land of the English. That what? And he juxtaposes this side of the Humber River and the far side of the Humber River. Well, the Humber River is what divides the area known as Northumbria from southern England, from the rest of Anglia and farther south. Okay, so Northumbria is just literally north of the Humber River. That's the area where Bede lived. That's the area where Alcuin lived before he went off to Germany. That's the area where Abbashild, Cadman, the Northumbrian, what's called the Northumbrian Renaissance, okay, was all way up north. Almost, including going to near the border of Scotland, okay? So he says, on this side of the Humber, there was what? He's talking about people who could read and understand Latin. So how many people, not a number, but a range, a figure, how many people on this side of the Humber does he say could translate from Latin into English? A few, very few. And north of the Humber? Not many. That's probably, I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here. That might be an example of Old English litotes, Litotes, which means extreme understatement. We're going to read in the poem, The Dream of the Rood, for example. Christ dies on the cross, they take him down, they bury him, and we're going to read that there was not a little troop surrounding him. Well, how not little of a troop? None. When he was buried, there wasn't anybody left. Okay, that's how small his army was. His host was with him. That's an example of understatement. So not many beyond the Humber. I think he really means there's nobody. And 150 years ago, 200 years ago, you could find a lot of people beyond the Humber River who could translate from Latin into English. Bear in mind, we're doing next week Bede and his story, his recounting of the story of Cadman, which is found in the Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Everything Bede wrote was written in Latin. And Bede was a polymath. He wrote treatises on music. He wrote treatises on astronomy. He wrote treatises on mathematics. He wrote biblical commentaries. He wrote histories. I mean, the guy did it all. Okay, he was John Milton, kind of before John Milton, etc. But Bede didn't write in English. He wrote entirely in Latin, for the simple reason he wasn't writing for the everyday, ordinary Anglo-Saxon. He was writing for other intellectuals, and Latin was the lingua franca, all the way up through 15th century, 16th century. Even when Thomas More writes Utopia in 1521, he writes it in Latin. So only other people who are familiar with Latin can read it, okay? So Alfred goes on. So south side of the Humber down here, there were only a few. Probably north of the Humber, there was nobody who could translate from Latin to English. Swafiawa, here waren that ich für dem anlepne, nemai yathinkian, besuden temeza, tha ich toricha feng, goda olmichtegum, siathonk, thata wenu aniya, anstal habeth, and that next word is hard to pronounce. Lerewa. On fourth on ich the bebilda Thought thu do so ich je leva, thought thu willa. Thought thu the this world thinga, totham yemakia, something like that. Swathu oftest maya, thought thu thona wisdom, wisdom, thethe god shelda, ther thu hiena, befesten maya, befesta. I'm just going to read to the end of the paragraph. Je think hrelch witu, usta bekomen, for this worlda, tha wehit no whither, ne, sorry, not no whither, no whither, ne selva, ne luvadan, ne ek odrum monum, ne lefdan, thonenamen anna, we luvadan fate, we kristna waren, on switha fiowa tha theowas. Okay, so back up. Swa fiowa hiara. Who wants to start there? So few there.
Word that I moreover a single no kin bingo.
Not kin, close. That's an example of looks like kin or cousin or man. What else can it be? Magen, may. Not may think. And I'm not able to think what? I mean, some translations do suggest that it's not no man think or thought. What's the Besuthan Temeza? To the south of the Thames. Okay. Somebody else want to pick up? Tha ichto. Often tha, sometimes it gets separated, tha, phrase, and then tha. Then, when, then. Sometimes then, when. Tha, ichto, richa. Then when, or then when, I, to, the kingdom, succeeded, took, came. We saw the word fang last week, and it was translated then, lost then, as received, I believe it was, okay? But it means when I took the kingship. Now, he didn't violently take the kingship from somebody else. It was given to him, okay? And notice the word for kingship there, riche, okay? So, word we had last week that was translated diocese. And I said the word was bishopric, biscepric. And I suggested, why not just translate it as bishopric? Because the rick there means the kingdom of the bishop. It's the place that the bishop rules. Where do we still see this word? Only we don't see it as often in English, except in reference to, and even then it's not in English, it's in German, the Second World War. It's the Reich. The Third Reich, Reich, R-E-I-C-H, okay? Third Reich was the Third Rome. What was the second one? Anybody know? The Holy Roman Empire. The first one was the Roman Empire, okay? So it means, can mean also empire, okay? So when I took the crown, empire, etc. So God Almighty what? Next line. Go Allmächtigum.
God Almighty, we thanks that we now any supply have teachers.
Yeah, that we have any supply of teachers. So, to God Almighty be thanked. If you're familiar at all with the English church, the Anglican church, every year they do what's called the lesson of carols. King's College Chapel, it's broadcast on NPR and stuff. at the end of every reading of the lessons. So these are, I think it's 8 or 9 biblical lessons, readings from scripture, and then there are Christmas carols sung. At the end of the reading of the biblical lessons, you'll always hear him say, "Thanks be to God." Well, that's exactly what this is. Thanks be to Almighty God. That, because of what? That we now have any. He's saying, thank you, Jesus, that we even have any teachers still around, right? And notice the word for teachers, leroa. What's the root of that? It's that lar, right? We still have that word today. How many of you have taken a course from, or plan to take a course from Dr. Hickson or Dr. Jackson? They both teach courses. I've taught an undergraduate one in folk lore. That's the word lore. What is that? Folk learning, folk teaching. It's the kind of everyday, ordinary kind of learning of the common people, right? But it literally means, it's translated, as teaching and such. On fourth on itch, fourth on almost always, therefore, or because. So, and therefore, or, and because I, stop. I what? I thank you, bebiode. Is it, okay, is it command? What is that in modern English? Because we do have that word in modern English. It gets shortened. The bay part gets dropped off. Bid. I bid. I ask you, okay? That, now, I said that, and I'll probably, yeah. And Marsden has the gloss as command. So it's, I mean, it's still okay to have command, but it's, trying to think how to put this. This is a good time. Let me see, I've got to bring up another page. Hold on, see if I can find it. One of you did an article about that, read an article by Nicole Gunther Descenza, Nicole Descenza Gunther. I can never remember her last name. That suggested that Alfred may have patterned the preface to the Pastoral Care after the prologue to, whose article was that? Sarah, was that yours?
I think.
Whose was it?
No, it wasn't mine. It was mine, Lainey.
Okay, it was a great article. So I went and pulled up the prologue to trying to get it to where I can see the prologue, and I can't get the gallery out of the way. There we go. So you should be able to see most of the prologue here. Yes or no? You do see it? Okay. Where this guy writes, he's translating what's called the Wisdom of Sirach. And he's the grandson of Sirach, right? Jesus ben Sirach or something like that. And he talks about the process of translation, which Alfred is going to deal with also. I'm trying to find where is he says here. And I'm not finding it. Where he talks about when you translate something. Prophets and there it is. Right here. I don't know if I can highlight that. Yes, I can. He says, for what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have the same force when it is in fact rendered in another language. Okay? And he says, in fact, not only in this case, but also in the case of the law itself and the prophets and the rest of the books, the difference is not small when these are expressed in their own language. Right? What does he mean by that? What's he saying? When you translate something from one language to another, what happens?
Loses some of its flavor, kind of, or original meaning?
Yeah, that's exactly what it does. We're going to see when we do Bede next week. Bede is going to say, you can't really fully, completely, translate from one language to another. Why? Because the one language, the words in the one language have resonance that's only felt in that language. So Bede is going to tell us the best you can do is you can get the gist of something. So, and I usually kind of talk about this the first day of class, and this semester's been so weird. I've just thrown everything out the window, how I normally teach it. When you translate, for example, when you're translating this, what is your goal? Whether, you're in your room, whatever, you're translating line by line. Think about it that way. One, what's your goal there? And then when we have Zoom class and, spotlights on you, what's your goal? I'll tell you what my goal was. Tell you what my goal was when I was in your shoes. One, when I was in class, not to make a fool of myself. That was number one, okay? Number two, to be right. So one is, whether I make a fool of myself, that's, side point. But to be right, what does that imply?
That there's one right translation.
Okay, very good. Is there one correct translation of, well, what was one of the words we had earlier when I suggested, bebioda? Is Marsden's gloss the only right translation? No, it's not. So when you see either the gloss at the bottom of the page, and one thing I would recommend you do, even when he gives you a gloss at the bottom of the page, turn to the back, look at the glossary. Why? Because on the bottom of the page, he's giving you one reading. Usually in the glossary, he'll give you more than one. And I didn't bring it in here with me today. If you pick up the Concise Anglo-Saxon Dictionary, that'll give you half dozen others. If you use online the Bosworth-Toller Dictionary or the Dictionary of Old English, even better. If you look up online some of these words in the Dictionary of Old English, it'll give you, for some of the words, it'll give you 10, 15, 20 different meanings. Each one slightly different than the others, okay? Why? Every translation, and I'm sure you've heard this before, every translation is an act of interpretation, right? Because you're doing what as you translate? You're telling yourself, Well, this is what that means. So you're interpreting it. So when you're translating, if you give yourself only one translation, you're really, really limiting it. Now, I'm not saying that you then go through, for each of these and you write multiple translations, because you've got lives, hopefully. You don't have the time to do that. But to allow what's life? To allow yourself the flexibility to look at how a word can have multiple meanings. For example, when we get the Old English poem, The Wanderer, we're going to get to a word in the first line. I think it's the end of the first line. And the word is Yebideth. G-E-B-I-D-E-F. Okay? I'm going to argue how you translate that one word. The poem is 120, 118 lines. It's 115, 116 lines. How you translate that one word, Yebideth, may determine how you interpret the entire poem. One word, right? Because that one word can be translated with at least 4 different meanings. And those 4 different meanings are radically different. Okay? So, as you translate, just, think of that possibility. The article that was talking about Alfred possibly modeling his preface on that prologue, that beginning of the wisdom of Sirach, I think that's a good article, because there are some striking similarities. I mean, the author of the prologue to Wisdom of Sirach is making some of the same arguments that Alfred is making here. Right? All right, so we left off with, therefore I command, and I think I interrupted, who was it? Was it Bethany who was translating, or Chelsea who was translating? Somebody was translating at that point. So I command or bid you that you do what?
Empty yourself of the affairs of this world.
Okay, hold on. Which word did you translate as empty? Because that first clause, and therefore I bid you, that you doswe ich yeliva that thu willa, that you do thus swa ich yeliva, I believe that you will do as I believe you will do. So act according to what I think you're going to do. And then that you what? Fathu thon of wisdom, faith in God, salva, that you what? The wisdom, the which, or the wisdom that to you God sealda. What's sealda? What's his gloss for it? Line 21, gave. What is sealda in modern English? What verb is it? Sell. Now there's an example, perfect example, how a word can shift its meaning over time. Here it means gave. God gave you this wisdom. Today, sell doesn't mean to give, right? Sell always and only means one thing. You give me money, and then I hand you something. It's a economic transaction. Here, sell means to just bestow, right? Ther, to hina befesten maya, befesta. All right? Somebody? It's line 21. Find my old translation.
That sort of a rough, it's probably a bit rough, but something like there where you apply be able to that extent.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, something like that. Okay. So, you think. Think what? You think what we do. What you think? Or what does
Banquet for the punishment of sin and pain, which is of this world.
okay? Keep going.
Then that we listen neither neither nor ourselves, nor love, nor each other person, nor allowed.
Okay. Okay, nor ourselves allowed. Keep going. Or somebody else keep going. You got a big long section that he glosses the entire thing for you. The phononomen to, lost my line again. Krishnawaran. That's glossed in the bottom of the page, 24. Phononomen. That name alone we loved, that we Christians were. That is, we loved solely to be called Christians. And Switha Fiawa Tha Theowas. What's that? What's the distinction that he's drawing?
They love very few of the practices.
Okay, so what's he saying?
Being Christian.
Yeah.
So like we love to be Christian, but we didn't really do what it means to be Christian.
We like to be called Christian, but we didn't want to really do the hard, dirty work of being Christian. You know, everything Christ talks about, Matthew 25, feeding the poor, visiting those in prison, clothing the naked, all that kind of stuff. Okay, that's pretty damning, right? I mean, this is the king, and he's writing this to a bishop. And he's saying, we, okay? We, you bishop, you high man of God, and me, the king, we collectively, but he's saying, we collectively what? All of us in England. Yeah, we like the name Christian, but we don't like to do the nitty-gritty of being Christian. Now look at the next paragraph, because we get a series of paragraphs that begin very similarly. Thought ich thought this al Yamunda, okay, line 26, and then line 36, thought ich thought this al Yamunda, exact same phrase, and then 43, tha Yamunda ich, a little bit different. And then 57, tha ich tha Yamunda, a little bit different. Right? What's he saying essentially in those two that begin, tha ich tha this eal Yamunda? when I,
When I remembered all this, is how I have it.
yeah, but you get the thaw, itch, thaw. So I think it's kind of a then when, or when then. When I then, kind of like Shakespeare's sonnet, which one? 30? When to the sessions of sweet silent thought, then. Or Chaucer's, opening to the Canterbury Tales. Juan that April with the sure sota, da 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 da, then long and folk to go on pilgrimage. When, big long adverbial phrase, then it gets completed, right? So, when I then remembered all this, or the Yemunda isn't necessarily remembered. What else can it be? Thought. When I thought about all this, when I considered all this. Because remembered kind of implies, that when you remember something, it's often something that you personally experience, right? It's your memory, okay? This is more than that, though, or this is not necessarily memory, personal memory on Alfred's part. This is Alfred kind of sitting there going, when I think about how things used to be, and I think about how things are now, what? Fa, Yamund ich hu ich Isaiah. Somebody want to pick up there? Then remembered / thought I what? Anybody? How I saw.
I saw before it all plundered and burned how the churches throughout all of England stood, treasures and books filled with.
Somebody else pick up? Good, Harlow. Let me back up before somebody else picks up. So, how I saw, before it was all for Herod, it's the same word we saw last week. Harried, destroyed, empty, plundered. And for burn, you've got that for, that intensive prefix. I've got that handout that I uploaded that gives some prefixes and shows how they intensify the meaning. I mean, this just means totally destroyed. I can pull up pictures. I can put them up for you. Go to Lindisfarne Abbey today. You can go there. When the tide's down, you can go out to the abbey and such. And it's pretty much a pile of rocks. When the Vikings raided and plundered Lindisfarne, they really raided and plundered Lindisfarne. Okay? Though, I will say this, the Vikings didn't do nearly as much to the abbeys and monasteries as Henry VIII did. Henry VIII did a whole lot more. He was absolutely horrible for the history of the monasteries and for the history of early English literature, because the libraries in the monasteries were destroyed under Henry VIII. And the monasteries that kept much of the literature alive, okay? So how they were, destroyed and burned, how the churches, Churchian, throughout all Anglican, the whole of the English people, stood, and you got that word magma. We're going to see that exact same word in Beowulf, in a very important passage that a lot of people think was added later to the poem. I think they're totally wrong, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. Magma, full of treasures, and boca gefildade. Filled means filled up. So filled with treasures and books. What kind of treasures would churches have? I mean,
Lots and lots of gold.
okay, like Smaug's hoard just lying around, piles of gold in the corners.
No, more like crosses and things like that are made of gold.
Crosses. I can show you pictures. I can post pictures. Think of, I don't know how well it's going to show up. It's not going to show up. Your book, okay, but imagine your book is a book of the Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Churches in Alfred's day would have, as Orthodox churches still do today, I don't know if Catholic churches do, would have the Gospels, and the Gospels would be in a cover. That cover in Alfred's day would have been gold, okay? And it would have had gemstones embedded in it, right? So you would have Gospels like that, and it would sit on the altar. Well, what else would be on the altar? You would have what's called the paten and chalice that would be used for the Eucharistic meal for giving communion to the people. You'd have a spoon, which would be made out of gold. You'd have a little knife-like thing that would be used to pierce the bread that is used to make the bread for the body and blood. Okay. All those things would be made out of gold. Okay? You'd have a processional cross that would be attached to a big, like, wooden rod, and the cross would be, anywhere from a foot to 2 to 3 feet tall, because some of these survive. That would be made out of gold, that would have gems embedded in it, right? So there'd be a lot of wealthy stuff. Why? Because the church didn't care about the poor, et cetera, et cetera? No, it was because the church was God's house, and you only, you use the best, so to speak. So he's talking about here so it's full of these treasures and books. Notice, the books are part of the treasures. What was it? Have any of you read Milton's Areopagitica? One of the great treatises against censorship. Milton writes, as soon kill a man as kill a good book. As soon kill a man, and what he really means is, as censor a good book. Why? Because the book is the embodiment of the man's mind. So when you censor, you are killing that mind, okay? So when he thinks all of this, and all of the great number of God's servants, I think that's where Harlow finished. So somebody pick up after Doris Theola, Antha Switha Litla Fiorma Faraboka Wiston, Verthamta Hiora Nanhut, On Yota Nemachtan, Verthamta Hia Naran on Hiora Agan, Yathioda Aritina. So somebody pick up with after the and, line 29, the Faswida Litla.
And very little benefits from the books new.
Okay, stop there. Why were there very little, why did they know very little benefits from the books?
Because they can't read Latin.
It's his whole point. There were all these great books, and nobody could read them. Okay? How many of you have seen, in a minute, Bronze, I'll let you out in a minute. I'm going to have to take a break in just a minute. How many of you have seen the film with Denzel Washington, The Book of Eli? Anybody? Well, it's set in an apocalyptic future. Books are very rare. And there's this guy, played by Denzel Washington. I'm going to give away part of it. Turns out he's blind. You don't know till the end that he's blind. And he's got this big, massive book. And all these people are trying to get the book from him because they think the book contains knowledge and power. And so this one guy gets the book from him. And he opens it up. And there are no words. There are dots. It's all written in Braille. And it turns out he doesn't even need the book. Eli doesn't need the book. Because, like the characters at the end of Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, he's got the book memorized. He's read it so much that he is then going to dictate it so that it can be written for others to read, right? So, because they didn't know the books, for Thomthe, therefore, what?
Of them, they understand. You can't understand anything
Right, but it's
from the books.
they, the he is plural, it's they, of them, the books, non-wood, nothing, on Yukon were able, to understand, not were able. Notice, by the way, throughout almost everything we read, how many double and sometimes triple negatives there are. Just throw that stupid rule from the 19th century about double negatives, canceling and not being proper English. That is a rule of 19th century grammarians. And the 19th century grammarian who came up with that did it on the basis of what? Anybody know? Arithmetic. Two negatives in arithmetic do what? They make a positive. This isn't arithmetic, thank God. Anyways, so they were not able to understand. For Thomthe, so go on, let's finish that sentence and then I'm going to take a very brief break. Like 1 minute. I'm just got to let my dog out. Go ahead.
Because they were not in their own language written.
Exactly. So the church has had all these books. And Alfred doesn't mention this. Well, he take that back. He does mention it. Yeah, about line 44. Okay. Some of the books weren't written in Latin. They were written in Greek. When Theodore of Tarsus comes around, what year is that? 625, 620s, I think. He comes to England to help, Augustine and such with his work. He brings with him, apparently, a whole bunch of manuscripts from Constantinople, Greek manuscripts. We know, many of them survived. We know that there was a pretty good, among the early Christian scholars in Anglo-Saxon England, a pretty good knowledge of Greek literature, Greek patristics, the fathers of the Greek church, etc., as well as the Latin fathers, St. Augustine and Tertullian and John Cassian and those guys. Okay, let me take about a 1 minute break. I'm going to pause this. Stop that. So, turn the page to 34, and I'm going to stop reading it, so let's just translate from here on. So, beginning with Swelchi Hiquaden. It was right. Yeah. Somebody want to pick up there and start to translate.
Places before occupied, they love the wisdom, and through it they acquire wealth, and us let out.
Okay. Just trying to see if there's anything to point out. Good. Somebody else. The next beginning, the Her Mon Mai. Whoever picks it up, how are you going to translate Mon? Is it man? Is it one? Hermonimai yet Yesian, Yeruswath, Aquahem Mekunan after Spiriam. So here are what? Anybody?
Here the people are still able to see their tracks, but we cannot follow after them.
Okay. Is it the people? That's what I was getting at the mon. Here one. Here one may yet, that's modern English yet, Yesian see their swav, ak, but we, them, not know how. I mean, that's what that literally means, or not able, after spirium. Okay? Follow. On fourth therefore, what? Or because we what? We have now either, so if there's either, it's going to be one of two things. We have now either, and there's one of those verbs with that for affix, that prefix for that intensifies it.
Have now lost both the wealth and the wisdom.
Exactly. So why is that therefore? What does he mean? We have now, therefore, we have now lost both the wealth and the wisdom. Is the wealth there merely talking about the mathmas, the treasures? Or does it mean more than that? Can the wealth also be, I guess I'm asking, can the wealth also be part of the learning that comes, part of the wisdom of the books? Okay. Fourth the, again, therefore or because, we nolden, and whenever you have that verb, either willan, W-I-L-L-A-N, or when it's made negative, ne willan, nellen, or past tense noldon, don't necessarily think that means, just simply will or would. Because usually in Old English, the noldon means did not desire, did not wish. Nellon, newillon, means do not wish or does not wish. Okay, so the root is wish or desire, not just simple modern English will, right? Because we desired not what? Totham spora med ura moda onluchten. We desire not. Go ahead.
Sorry, that we would not desire to then track with our mind then.
Yeah. So what does it mean to bend our minds?
Open our mind,
Okay. Keep going.
or change it, or
Think of
adapt it.
think of it as something upright like this. Okay. When you talk about nouns, for example, when you talk about nouns, when you're talking about an infinitive noun, the noun is trying to get my hand to go upright and I can't because it's reversed. I didn't reverse my camera. It's upright. If it's declined, what do? Why does a noun decline? According to case, number, gender, etc. What does that mean? It follows after, okay? So it goes with something else. So he's talking about the mind doing what? Bending. Well, have you ever been outside, and this might be a rhetorical question, I don't mean it to be. Have you ever been outside like after a fresh snow and seen tracks and try to follow them? Sometimes what do you have to do? You got to bend over so that you can see them clearly. That's the image he wants us to have. That of the mind bending itself, getting down closer to try to follow this path that has been led, okay? Then we get that phrase again. Thought ich thought this alimunda. Then when I think about all this, that is when I really consider, he's not talking about, just sitting there with a beer in his hand, kind of whiling away the time. He's talking about serious meditation on the meaning of life, okay? Then what? Tha wundrada. Modern English, almost exactly the same. Wondered. The D-R-A, modern English, D-E-R-E, the R-A becomes E-R through a process of what's called metathesis. Old English, for example, you wouldn't talk about a bird. You'd talk about a brid, B-R-I-D. Chaucer even writes in Parliament of Fowls, 1382, something like that. In the Parliament of Fowls, he has a line where he mentions the thrida brida, the third bird. Well, the R-I/IR, right, that metathesis, that changing of the R-I to I-R happens in about 100 years within, slowly over about 100 years after Chaucer's time. We see the same thing. You're going to see the verb. In fact, we've already seen it. You're going to see the verb sometimes for to burn in Old English as brenna, B-R-E-N-N, right? Whereas in modern English, it's B-U-R-N. So when I think about all this, then wondered I what? Somebody pick up with Switha, Thara, Godina, Wiotana, etc. Then wondered I, and the Switha, you've got a long gloss at the bottom of the page. Lines 36, 37, bottom of the page. Switha, very much. Tharagodina Witana, then I wondered very much of Thara Godina Wiatana, those good, wise men. See, the Witan, W-I-T-A-N, that was actually an office that was held by a group of men surrounding the king, around the king. Okay? I mentioned last week when Edward the Confessor died and Harold Godwinson was chosen king. He was chosen king by the Witan, the counselors of good, wise men, essentially. Today, we can debate whether or not they're good or wise, and they're not all men anymore. Today, the president has what? A cabinet, right? Well, the cabinet is this secretary and that secretary and that secretary. It's the same. That's where the idea of the cabinet comes from. It goes all the way back to at least Old English times, right? He thinks about, very much about these good, wise men. What? That you waren Jan Anglican.
There long ago were throughout England and all the books fully studied have.
Okay.
Ye not
I was going to say, just pause for a minute after I have them. So these good, wise men, what? In the past, long ago, throughout all England, had done what? They'd read these books that were in the libraries, that were in the monasteries, that were in the churches. So he's saying, he's juxtaposing the churchmen of his day, the priests and such of his day, with the priests of long ago. And he's saying, long ago, they were able to read all these books. Now, they can't, right? That, lady, you can keep going if you want, or somebody else can pick up with, that here, hera, fanana, etc. That that's here, hera, what?
Not any part of them did not wish to them own language translate the book.
They didn't translate the books into their own language. Well, why? Why didn't they translate all these books from Latin and Greek into their own language? They didn't need to. See, that's part of his point. And that's part of what the author of the prologue to The Wisdom of Sirach was saying. If you know the original language and you can read it in the original language, what does that do for you? You get more benefit from that than you do from reading it in a translation, okay? What else does that also imply? I mean, we've got the phrase, knowledge is power, right? So if you have the knowledge of the quote unquote secret books, the knowledge of the hidden books, that gives you power. Why did it take essentially over 1,000 years for the Bible to be translated into the common language of everyday ordinary people, into the vernacular?
Because the church has the power to translate the message to people.
Okay. It could be because the church wanted, that power. We control the words, we control the meaning, we control you, okay? Protestant Reformation came around, 16th century, and, there were three kind of mottos or slogans, if you want, sound bites. And one of the chief of those was sola scriptura, scripture alone. And what the reformers meant by that is, you sit, Joe Blow, Joe Farmer, down at his desk, you give him the Bible in his language that he can read, and he can figure it out for himself. Sola scriptura, sola fide, sola gratia. The Bible alone, faith alone, grace alone. That's it. You don't need a priest, you don't need bishops, you don't need a pope, the whole 9 yards, right? But in Alfred's day, that wasn't the thought pattern, right? Now, the Bible had been translated. You had Jerome translate it from manuscript materials into the Vulgate in 5th century. Vulgate just meaning vulgar Latin, kind of common Latin, right? That was the version used in the churches for the next literally the next 1,000 years, right? You had all kinds of, versions before Jerome in Greek, Syriac, Aramaic, etc. I mean, those are the source materials, okay? Late Middle Ages, you had John Wycliffe, who started doing some translating into Middle English. It wasn't a literal translation. We do have parts of the Bible in Old English. We've got the Old English Gospels. We've got all the Gospels, okay? You've got both the Heptateuch and the Hexateuch. You've got the first 7 Bibles, the first 7 books, the first 8 books of the Bible translated. You've got poetic translations of other books of the Bible. That is, we've got the book of Daniel retold as poetry, for example, okay? But there is an awful lot that isn't translated, okay? So he said, these guys were smart people. They were good people. They were wise people, but they didn't translate it into the language for everybody, okay? So, and notice line 39. Yeah, notice line 39, the word that he uses for translate, windon. Anybody know what other word that is? Or a modern word that is at least related to it? Wine. Think of the Beatles song, whose title just The Long and Winding Road. That's the windon. Okay? It means kind of to wander or to turn. So he's using this verb kind of metaphorically. You are literally what? You're turning something from one thing into another, right? So, ac ich das Sonne eft, but I then soon, somebody pick up. What did he do? That whole sentence is very interesting. Go ahead.
All right, go ahead.
That he answered and said,
Yeah, to himself. He's like, I sat down and I asked myself, I said, an ich das Sonne eft myselfum, I answered weirda myself, on means against their kind of, weirda, he spoke a word against himself and said, now pick up.
Let's see, where am I? May not imagine that always men shall so carelessly become, and that teaching becomes so decayed.
Okay. Keep going, or somebody else.
By desire they it left and hoped that the more wisdom in the land, the more our languages we know.
So he's saying people will be wiser with the more languages they know. There will be more learning in the land if the people are what? This is one of the huge things said about modern Americans, that we are linguistically ignorant, because most Americans know what languages?
English.
American, yeah, English, right? Go to Europe, pick almost any country, and you can walk down a side street in a small town in that country and have a conversation with almost anybody in that country, because they're taught English, even though English is not their native first language, other than England, obviously. Several years ago, my daughter was spent several months in Prague teaching English. So the rest of my family, maxed out the credit card, airplane tickets, Airbnb, you know, and we went over for 14 days around Christmas. And we could talk to almost everybody. There were very few people who did not speak any English at all. Same thing when we were in airports, things like that, okay? So he's saying, if people are bilingual, here bilingual meaning they can speak and read Latin, okay, and speak and read English, they'll be better off. For Thara Wilnunga, no, you did that part. So, line 43. Thayamunda itch. Somebody else? Hold on, your break. It's okay. You're kind of breaking up a little bit. Yeah. So say that again.
Then thought I have a law with earth in the Hebrew language
Yep.
found. And again, then they the Greek learned.
Okay, so pause there.
Then
Hold on, pause there. Why? He's talking about the translation of the Old Testament, originally written in Hebrew, into Greek, into what's called the Septuagint. It's called the Septuagint because 72, according to the story, 72 Greek speakers each took the Old Testament, set period of time, they translated the whole thing, and all 72 translations matched perfectly. That's the story given. And this wasn't around, I just taught the Bible last year. What year was this? This is in the 2nd century BC. Okay? Okay, now go on. Continue, Lainey.
the Greek, then wisdom in it, these again, and each of the other books, and first the Roman in the same way, when it then learned.
Or when it learned. Okay, go ahead. Or somebody else. Go ahead if you want to continue.
Then learned it then translates
Okay, but
all three learn.
are you on line 46?
I think so.
Okay, there they learn. Then they Wyndon. Somebody else pick up with line 46, since Lane's done a lot. Or don't do it line by line. What's the gist, let's say, from 45 to the end of that paragraph? If you've got a more polished, kind of translation, just do that. So what is Alfred trying to get across?
Well, he's stating that the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew into Greek, and then the Romans continued that process, preserving work, and then it goes on that, let's see, and also all the other Christian peoples in their own language.
Exactly.
That there's certain, and then he's making the argument that there's certain books that are most necessary for all people.
Good. Yeah, the need, that's a hard word to say. Need betherfosta, most needful. Okay, and the line just before that, where he starts, "Forthi me thinketh betra," therefore it seems better to me. Okay, if you also think the same as I do. Again, he's talking to Bishop Werfurth. Now, Werfurth, I'm pretty sure your introduction mentions, Werfurth actually did one of the translations for Alfred. Yeah, bottom of, I'm using my older edition. Bottom of the introduction, Werfurth translated the dialogues of Gregory the Great at Alfred's request, okay? So he says, I hope you will think or agree, as I do, there are, these books that are most needful for us, okay? Somebody else, keep going. What does the last line of that paragraph say? Laramon said on further on Laden ye Theoda, thought them on further Laren Willa onto Hiran Hada Don Willa.
After that, teach men further in Latin. Those men will further learn and will be promoted to a higher office.
So what's he talking about, higher office?
Clergy.
Yeah, he's talking about the clergy. Okay. There's this commonplace idea today, and it's commonplace because it's partially true, at least, that in the Middle Ages, there were an awful lot of priests who didn't understand Latin. Okay? They were celebrating Mass in Latin. They could speak the words, but they didn't understand it. In fact, it's thought that the phrase that magicians use at kids' birthday parties, hocus pocus. Anybody know what that is supposed to come from? It's a bastardization of hoc est corpus, the Latin of the words of institution. It's called the words of institution, in the liturgy or in the Mass, when the priest calls the Holy Spirit down upon the gifts and says, hoc est corpus, this is my body. And he goes on, shed for you. Well, hoc est corpus is the point in Roman Catholic thought, at least it was in the Middle Ages, I can't say that it is necessarily now, was the point at which the bread and wine are transubstantiated into the body and blood of Christ. So hoc est corpus, well, hocus pocus, look, magic. Well, if you don't understand what you're saying, right? For example, I'm not casting aspersions to anybody. When you guys go through and read this aloud, to me, it's kind of like, and even when I do it, it's kind of like hocus pocus. Why? It's not our native language, right? Learn any foreign language, and when you start learning it, you mess things up. You move syllables around because they don't sound right in your mouth and such, right? So what is somebody translate? Okay, so the next paragraph. Tha ich tha yamunda, when I think about, remember this, then what? How is lar learning, teaching, Laden theodos of the language of the Latin tongue, thisum aphalum. What's he saying? When I considered
How the learning of the Latin language has fallen, or was fallen, or was decayed across the English nation.
Keep going. Or somebody else, but you can keep going if you want, Chelsea. Anthea. Is that and though? Trying to see what he gives. What line is that? 58, not 48. and yet. It's the word from which we get though. Here's one of the things I like to suggest, and you don't have to do it by any means. If the word has a modern English derivative, I mean, if you're able to look at a word and say, oh, that's modern English, yet. Use modern English, yet. Or if it's modern English, though, fair, use modern English, though. I mean, it's a lot more, it makes a lot more sense to use the modern English form than it does to use something else. Okay? And you're going to see that there's going to be a lot of stuff that Marsden will often throw in a Latinate English translation. That is a word in modern English that comes through Latin. But there might be a modern English word that comes from Old English that would work a lot better. Just throwing that out there. Okay? And though many, what? Kudan English Yerit Araden. Many could or knew what?
Many adu.
Okay. Then ongan began I ongamong, odra mislichum, etc. Then I began to what?
There are various and numerous spirits in the kingdom.
So,
Book wisdom in English.
so then I, keep going, Lainey. Get to the end of Pastoralis.
Then is named in Latin pastoral care.
Okay, so stop there. So he says, let me back up. And though many knew English Yerit Araden, knew how to read English writing, then began I, among various and many problems, cares, concerns of the kingdom. In other words, you know, I've got the Vikings over here to put down, etc. It's kind of like, you know, Prince Humperdinck and the Princess Bride. I've got my wedding to plan. I've got Gilda to invade. I've got so-and-so to blame. He did what? Amidst all the problems going on, I decided it was important for book Winden to translate in English that is called in Latin Pastoralis. So with all these other problems going on, I decided, you know, I'm going to add on to my plate to translate St. Gregory the Great's Cura Pastoralis. And in English, hear the book. That is, it's called in English, hear the book. Why is it called hear the book? What's hear the book? Shepherd's book. Okay? Very, very interesting. That word hirda there is spelled a variety of ways. Here it's H-I-E-R-D, various endings. It's also spelled H-Y-R-D, heard, and it has multiple meanings. It can mean shepherd. It can mean, in some contexts, priest. It can mean guard. It can mean protector. It can mean savior. It can mean king. For example, it's used several times to refer to David. Hear David, but not as shepherd David, as King David. It's used in Beowulf to refer to Beowulf. It refers to Hrothgar. It refers to, once I believe, the dragon, and it refers to Grendel's mother. Wow, how can, you know, Grendel's mother be called a shepherd? Well, she's the protector, guardian, ruler, king of her little halls, so to speak. So, I mean, it's one of those words, a lot of different meanings. So you got to look at it in context and, choose wisely, in other words. Okay? So it's also called in English, the shepherd's book. Somebody go on. Huilam word be, warda huilam anyet of anyeta. Which almost, go ahead.
At times word for word and at times sense for sense, just as I learned it from all of the people that you learned it from.
From my Archbishop, Playmunda, and Asherah, my Archbishop, and at Grimbalda, my Mass Priest, and John, my Mass Priest. So 2 priests and 2 archbishops. So what's he saying? He's saying, this is how I was taught to translate. And how did he say that again? Wheelam warda be, warda wheelam anyet of anyeta, etc. So, Alfred highlights the 2 basic methods of translating. I'm reading this direct from the gloss. Literally, word for word, or more freely according to sense. So I asked you earlier, when you translate, what is your goal? And I suggested that when I was in your shoes, and we were around the class, 1, not to make a fool out of myself, which has nothing to do with the meaning of the text, so to speak, but 2, to be right. Well, what does it mean, though, to be right? Word for word? I mean, if you do that phrase literally word for word, it's not going to make a lot of sense. So what do you have to do? You have to get the sense and then try to be as close to the word for word. In other words, it's both the spirit of the law and the word of the law. It's both the literal and the figurative, okay? And he says that's how he was taught by 2 archbishops and 2 priests. Okay, cool. So, Sithin ich hiatha, that is, therefore, I have what? He's saying, because this is how I've learned to do this, what? Swa ich hier forstod, somebody. Swa, just as, so, thus.
Understood it
Okay, keep going.
as I could render is how I have it.
The onion, is that how you, I can barely, just, I've got to get my eyes checked. Because I'm looking at the onion list and trying to see what Marsden gives us the gloss there, 65. Thus I it most intelligibly on yet full cost. The cost ending is superlative. So it's kind of saying in most fully, most completely, okay? Might Erechian. That the root of Erechian is the REC at the beginning, okay? And actually it should be pronounced Arekkayan. Arekkayan. That might make it a little bit easier to understand in its modern sense. What's the root? REC, rec. As in reckon. Gerard Manley Hopkins, one of his poems, God's Grandeur, where he has the line, we now reck not his rod. That is, we consider not, we don't think about God's rod. Okay? Your gloss tells you render. Yeah, but it's really, and that it most completely might reckon, understand. Okay, but he means to reckon it for others, to put it in words others could understand, right? And therefore, sorry, that's not in there. I, here on English, and that's where you get the translate part, awenda. That is, once he fully understood it, then he did what? That's when he then translates. So does that mean you guys don't have to do next week's because you can't yet fully understand until you've really studied old? No, it doesn't. You still have to do next week's. But what does it mean? What does he imply there? It's not merely just, word, glossary, and plugging one word in that the glossary has. Because what do you then have to do to it? You got to make sense of it. You got to be able to look at it. After you do that word for word, extremely literal, you then have to do what? You got to put it into English you understand. You understand. Because if you don't understand it, I sure as hell won't understand it. It's a famous saying because it's true. And I didn't realize it was true until I experienced it for the first time. You don't really understand something. You don't really know something. And I know several of you are GTAs and stuff. You don't really know or understand something until what? Until you teach it. I had taken a class as a doctoral student in the history of the English language. Next semester, I started Old English. Had Beowulf the following semester. The same semester I was taking Beowulf, I was doing a independent study tutorial type thing in Old Norse, Viking. So I'm learning Old Norse at the same time as I'm still, kind of learning Old English, and they're enough similar to really screw you up because you look at a word in Old English and you think, oh, it's this in Old Norse. Well, it's not this in Old Norse because it's Old English kind of a thing. I think it was one semester later, the university needed somebody to teach history of the English language on their satellite campus on the Gulf Coast at Gulfport. Well, the guy who taught me Old English and history of the English language, he didn't want to drive down there from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. It's about a 70-mile drive, a little over an hour long, 85, 90 miles actually. He didn't want to drive down there. And the person they had teaching, died or something, didn't want to do it anymore. And he recommended I do it. I was like, third year doctoral student. Well, in order to do it, you had to be named, quote unquote, to the graduate faculty. I was still a graduate student. And they had to, make me an adjunct graduate professor so that I could do that. And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll try, I'll do it. And I walked in there, metaphorically blind as a bat. Up here, yeah, I got an A in history of the English language. I'd had a foundations of Indo-European anthropology, so I had more linguistics kind of there. I had the information down. Getting it from up here to out there, that was a learning curve, okay? That's where you are right now. Because you're going through and you're piecing together translations, and it's taking a while, I think, right, to make the sense of it. It will come. You're only, 3 weeks in still, right? 3 weeks from now, a lot of what you're doing now, you will look back at and go, okay, I could fix that translation. I can make that better. And when we get into the poetry, it's going to be another huge learning curve. Poetry ain't prose. They don't work the same, right? So he says, I translated into English. On to Alicum Bishop Stola on Minum Reacher Willa Anna. Somebody, we're almost at the end, both of the translation and the class. So he will do what? On to Alicum Bishop Stola, which is line 66.
And to each bishop in my kingdom.
Yep, keep going.
I will send forth one and with each a bookmarker, which is a 50-minute.
Yep, okay, so stop right there. The bookmarker that he's mentioning, that's the Alfred Jewel. That's what we assume the Alfred Jewel was, okay? And the 50 gum Monkessa, that is, it's worth like 15 pieces of gold. In other words, these things, these are expensive. These are really valuable. Just look at the thing. It's not something, you know, that you stamp out. It's handmade, hand carved, hand wrought, the whole 9 yards, okay? So, and I bid or command, if you want to use Marsden's earlier gloss, I bid or command in God's name, what? That no man that astle, that bookmark, that book pointer thing, from that book, not do. So don't do the bookmark from the book. Don't take the jewel from the book. 4 copies of the book survive. None of the bookmarks, other than the one that was found in the guy's field in 1695, right? By chance. Nor the book from the minster, right? So don't remove the bookmark from the book, and don't remove the book from the monastery, from the church, okay? So somebody pick up there. Uncouth. That's what that word literally is. Uncouth. Who anybody? Uncouth longeth there swa Yalarida Bishopasian Swaswanu Godathonk. What? Go ahead.
It is unknown how long their such learned bishops may be, so that now, so sorry, my hands are running.
That's okay.
Trying to figure out what I'm like. God through so almost sent.
Not through. Godathonk. Notice the God has the E ending, which we saw when? The first day of class, I think, second day of class. That tends to be dative case, dative or instrumental. Thanks be to God. Thanks be to God what? Well aware that is everywhere, seeing them. So what has he just said? There are bishops now who understand this, and let's kind of essentially hope that continues. Line 70. Fourthly, ich wollte that hier. Fourthly is therefore. I desire, I wish, I want, I will. That here, that's the 2 things together. They, the book and the marker, what? At Tharastoa Werin. Okay? Tharastoa. What place? You see places throughout England named something Stoa. Felix Stoa. It kind of means happy place. Okay? what's the other one? There's one in East Anglia. You can go there today. It's kind of like Colonial Williamsburg or Plymouth Plantation up in Rhode Island, where you can go and you can walk through and see what an Anglo-Saxon village was like. And it's something. What is that? Something Stoa. I can't remember the first name, first part of it, right? I hope, I want the book to stay there. Button say bishop. Bhutan. Except the bishop. He amid him habad will o the hiawara. Unless the bishop does what?
Unless he has it with elsewhere on loan, or if someone should be copying another.
Unless the bishop allows the book to be borrowed. But really, it's only for what reason? So that it can be copied. Okay? To make more copies, to give to priests, etc., etc. Okay? So, let me ask a question. We won't go to 540. Was there anything in this translation or in this translation exercise process that stood out to you for its difficulty? Was there any part that was particularly troubling, or was it merely the matter of slogging through?
I think the repetitive, like whenever it said then when, so having those two words that are the same beside each other was the most confusing for me.
Okay.
And all the tharas and those first,
Yeah, just
demonstrative
the demonstrative pronouns and the personal pronouns can be killers, because even though in I think in the little grammar I gave you and in the reference grammar in the back, he gives forms, for example, for the personal pronouns, and it'll show, HI and HIE as being representative of something. Well, there will be a lot more forms than that, for the simple reason that, and he mentions this in the introduction here, there are dialectal variances. Alfred's writing in not the late West Saxon dialect that most of the manuscripts that survive are copied in. Alfred's writing in an earlier West Saxon dialect. So where we often expect to see an EO, Alfred has an IO, okay? Where we often will expect to see like an HEO, we'll see an HIO. And so, HEO, that's she, and you see that and you automatically know that's she every time. HEO is she, right? But you see HIO and sometimes HIE, wait a second, that HIO can also be she. Sometimes it's a variant spelling for it. Well, she and it are two different things. And HIE and HI is also it, but HIE is also used for plural they. So, it can get very, very confusing. Just wait, give you a little advance warning. 2 weeks from now, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle passage for Kenilworth and Kenilworth. You're gonna do what Sarah just did. Sarah just, put her hands over her face, threw her head back, and you're gonna want to pull your hair out. Okay?
Yeah, you're gonna cry a lot.
It's one of the hardest things you'll translate. And it's because of the use of pronouns. The characters are named, I don't know, out of the 60 lines, maybe 3 or 4 times. And everything else is a frickin' pronoun referring back to somebody. And you get, and so, and he did it to them, who did it, and you're, who's doing what to whom? Be clear. Well, I mean, they're not clear. Okay, so I'll just throw that out. What else? Anything else? Are you starting to get a feel for inflectional endings on words, so that when you see a RA at the end of a word or an ES, you can go genitive plural, genitive singular, dative, always dative plural, even though sometimes the dative plural is translated as a singular, Lord's Prayer, in heavenum, but it gets translated in heaven, not the heavens, usually. Those are the kinds of things, it helps if you do what I did, what I suggested that, I think it was the first day, write those cards and write out those endings, add words to endings, just, I know, in the spare time that you have, okay? Just kind of work on that. Same thing with verb conjugations. Looking at the ON, the AN, the EN endings, okay? You can look at certain verbs, you see an ON, and you know automatically it's plural, okay? In fact, it's past tense plural. So the subject has got to be plural, whatever the subject is. So you start looking for a plural form of a noun, kind of a thing, all right? For next week, if we don't have any other questions about this, for next week, we're doing Bede's Story of Cadman. And I need to see how much of that is given. Okay, so for today, you had about 70 lines. Just a little warning. Next week's just about 110. So a third as much as long. And this is in section, am I doing, did I say only Cadman? Yeah, I did. Shoot, okay. I think in the past I've had you do 9A and 9B, but that's way too much, because that would be a total of about 170 lines, and that's too much to throw at you right now. So it's the Miracle of Cadman. And you get in there, okay, Cadman's hymn. So we'll go over the we'll try to do the translation of all the entire passage, but I also want to talk a little bit starting next week, even though we're not really starting real poetry until October 13th. A little bit about poetry and how the poetry works. And I want to suggest that in preparation for that, look at the section. I'll find it. The section in beginning Old English, it's like section 5, beginning poetry. I would strongly recommend you just kind of read through roughly pages 29 through 34. Okay. Don't obsess or stress on it all. Just read through it. Okay. He talks a little bit about meter, talks a little bit about alliteration, how the poetry works. Cadman's hymn's very, very short. We'll probably actually spend a lot of time talking about the hymn itself. In preparation for discussing Cadman, there's about 110 lines. I said there are 7 of you total. Translate all of it, obviously. I mean, I want each person to translate all of it. But if you guys want to, I shouldn't say this, but I will. If you guys want to, among yourselves, kind of divvy it up and say Elizabeth says, you know, I'll do the first, it's 110 divided by 7 is 7, 14, that's 5. If you want to, divide among yourselves and say, Elizabeth says, I'll do the first 15 lines. And Chelsea says, I'll do 95 to 110. And Harlow says, pick a number where it's more or less evenly divisible. It's going to be about 15, 16, maybe 17 lines. So that when I say, okay, who wants to start? And you want to surprise me, and whoever's agreed to do those lines, we can do it that way. That doesn't mean, I'm going to throw this out, that doesn't mean I might not call on an individual to do some lines that you've not, quote unquote, polished. That is, if you guys do that among yourselves, and you each agree to take like 16 lines, I would expect for those 16 lines to be better than just literal word for word. That is, you need to have the literal word for word, but then have the polished form, right? I still expect you to have that for all 110 lines, right? You kind of get what I'm getting at here, right? And the reason I'm doing that is I found it enables you to put on a better face, and we kind of get through the material a little quicker. I'll just give you a horror story. When I was doing this, when I was in your shoes, one of the members in the class, and the class was pretty small also, it was like, I don't know, 6 or 7. Nah, I take that back. I think there were 9. There were only 6 or 7 available. One of the members in the class was a local Jackson, Mississippi high school Latin teacher. She'd been teaching Latin for years. I mean, she knew Latin very, very well. And she came to class one day totally unprepared. I mean, literally unprepared. She hadn't translated whatever the material was. But she came in and she had something, she had her book and she had something inside it. Well, she'd gotten a translation somewhere of whatever it was we were doing. And so, the professor called on her and she started translating the material, meaning reading from this translation. And he stopped her and, pointed out a specific word and said, now what about, and she was lost because she couldn't talk about that particular word. And he literally, now this is the dark ages, but he literally spent the next, it seemed like the entire class period, which it was a 3-hour class, but it was probably only 5 or 10 minutes. I mean, just raking her over the coals. And the rest of us just wanted to crawl under the table and go away. I mean, she was literally in tears, streaming down her face by the end of that day. But she never did that again. She came back every other, and everybody after that point, they had it all done, etc. So just, I'm not going to rake anybody over the coals. I might send an email afterwards and say, make sure you have it all done, kind of a thing. If I call on you and you don't have it, if you don't have it done, let me know. I mean, I'll cut you a lot of slack, but just let me know before class begins, okay? And hopefully it'll be a good reason. It wasn't, you know, I went on a binger the night before and it was totally, and I, you know, lost it or dog-ate it or whatever. Okay, so next week, and I hope next week will be pretty interesting, because Cadman's story is very important for the history of Old English literature and all English literature, because he's the first English poet. All right, questions, concerns? Oh, parsing. Parsing. What do we want to parse? Parse the first 4 lines of Cadman's hymn. Okay? So it's lines 31 through 34. It'll be a little bit easier because it's shorter than the rest of the, you know, the other lines, but parse the first 4 lines. So, and I've got to come up with a simplified parsing form. You know, all the verbs, all the nouns, all the pronouns, all the adverbs, all the adjectives, which there aren't many other words. There are very few conjunctions, very few prepositions, so it's almost every word in the first 4 lines, okay? So parse those. And when you do your parsing, couple things. So, you know, write out the words, identify the words above, what part of speech, you know, all that kind of stuff they are. Do the literal translation below. And then after the whole thing, I'm going to throw this curveball at you. Try to give me a poetic translation of those 4 lines. Right? Just do your best. Without, you know, really understanding how the poetry works. Just, you know, try to give me a poetic translation of those 4 lines. All right, that's all, unless you have other questions or comments or concerns. None? Okay. We will see you next week at 2:40. Have a good rest of the week. Bye.